I'm Annika Leonard, and I have been an advocate for the prevention and intervention of domestic and sexual violence for about 20 years now. I've done this work both informally and formally within my community. So I intersect with a lot of committees within the domestic and sexual violence world, and what that looks like is sitting on like local committees as well as national committees to basically bridge the gap between like the community and the systems that are interacting and engaging with residents in the community, and making sure that there's like dignity and humanity like communicated across the board. As a survivor of date rape, I went to a law enforcement officer and was treated like crap. Was treated like absolute crap in systems, in the hospital system. I remember being 16 and being a child survivor of sexual assault and going to my doctor, and the doctor like making comments to the point where at 16, I wanted to see what she was writing in my chart. So I ordered my chart and saw that she wrote things that I said to myself, why would she say that about me? You know, and I just couldn't understand, you know, I could not understand. So it is so important for me to do this work because I know what it's like to be on the other end, to have less power in society, or to feel like I have less power, and to have those in power impose their values and their views on me, tell me who I am versus seeing me for who I am, you know. So I was used to that part. So I said, I need to help other folks feel their power and flip the script, because we are powerful. Our voices are powerful. Our experiences are powerful. Our experiences do not define us. And because our experiences do not define us, that means that we have more to contribute, you know, and so my passion around this is making sure that other folks know that they have more to contribute, that this was an experience, that there's life after this experience, but while you're in this experience, this process, there are folks who are advocating for these systems to make sure that when you do experience this, that you are treated with dignity, that you are treated with care, with concern, just as if this were their family member on the table, or being interviewed on the stand, or being interviewed by law enforcement. We need to make sure that we are treating folks with dignity, and I have to say that word over and over again, dignity and humanity. I think that SARTs need to unlearn a lot of behaviors, right? Because if we're talking about systems, and I use the word systems a lot, but systems are made up of people. And people have been trained and have been taught in a lot of ways that are just harmful to other folks, right? Because we keep saying marginalized communities and underserved communities. In actuality, these are people, these are humans who have a lot of trauma in on this land, you know? So when we're talking about like how, you know, we can create space for non-traditional folks to come to the table, we're talking about people like actually doing the work and unlearning some of the harmful practices, because there are a lot of folks who can contribute greatly to the work that we're doing. Because SARTs are made of people who are engaged in systems, and so there's a level of bias that comes along with that, right? There's a system that says that, hey, I know what's best for you, and I know what's best for your life, and I'm going to tell you what's best for you in your life. I'm going to tell you how we prevent this sexual assault. I'm going to tell you how you experience the sexual assault, and that's not okay. You know, that's actually counteracting the reason why the SART exists to begin with. You know, it's like SARTs are supposed to advocate and to make sure that, you know, the victim or the survivor receives justice. And sometimes justice is denied before that person even makes it to trial, if that person even reports, you know. So I think that we need to kind of take a step back and kind of look at ourselves and say, like, you know, like, yes, this is my job, but then, you know, there are people who are living this day in and day out. So a sexual assault response starts like literally when I'm in my community. It literally starts when I'm at my house and someone says, hey, this is what happened to me. It literally starts over a text or a Facebook inbox, or, you know, things of that nature. And those are the things that we should take into consideration when we're building teams. It's like, how do people who are not attached to a system or a sexual assault service provider, a law enforcement entity, like how do those folks like really engage in the sexual assault response. And it looks a lot different sometimes, and it doesn't look as professional as some folks may deem it. It may look like me being an advocate for teens. It may look like me taking this teen to Applebee's, or something along that nature. And that's my response. But that may be deemed unprofessional, or it could have all kinds of red flags to a person who's on a traditional SART team. And I think that, like, in creating a new way of being in terms of non-traditional members, means that we've got to open the box and think outside of what our traditional systems say. Because once again, like, these systems have been put in charge of folks' lives and their autonomy. And it's like, hey, we're here. Like, why are we upholding this standard that says that you know better than me what my life should be and how I should respond to this, and the legitimacy of my experiences? Involving non-traditional members into a SART is it's a process, and it's really a journey. So when you're involving folks who are not traditionally at the table, when I'm saying who's not traditionally at the table, I'm talking about community members. I'm talking about those who have been impacted by the sexual harm. And when they're impacted by sexual harm, they're not necessarily seen, even by SART members, as the most credible or the people who are able to speak to the experiences in a way that sounds professional. So there sometimes seems to be a double standard. And when that double standard is present, it makes it a little difficult to involve folks. So that's why I say it's a journey and it's a process, because people from underserved communities are not used to and are not invited often to talk about their experiences. And sometimes those experiences offer criticisms for the system and the folks who are at the table. So law enforcement and child protective services and hospital systems. And that becomes a little difficult to hear the criticisms, but to hear it through the lens of, like, when you apply these criticisms to the work that's being done, then you're ensuring that all survivors have dignity and all survivors are, like, on their healing path or journey. I think the best way to engage communities at the margins comes from, I'll put my community organizing hat on. I always have my feet to the pavement. So there are community-based organizations that are set up to serve specific cultures, right? There are youth-serving organizations. There are different, like the African American Chamber of Commerce. There are different, like, places in the communities that you can go to, in addition to, like, looking at the census and things of that nature. And there are always informal leaders. So if you really got your ear to the ground, you already know who those folks are who can bring, people to the table to engage in the SART. Oh, the benefits of a non-traditional member to a SART are enormous. So there is a awesome amount of wealth of energy that non-traditional SART members bring, knowledge of how these systems impact. So when a sexual assault survivor joins a SART, there is this level of almost innocence to a system. Like law enforcement officers are used to engaging with folks from hospitals. Folks from hospitals are used to engaging with folks from child protective services. Everyone is interconnected in those ways. And a survivor comes in, and most times if we're talking about a survivor from a underserved community, then that survivor has already encountered most of those systems on different levels already. And so their interaction with those systems did not just start with the SART. And I think that is one of the things that is most important to take into consideration, and also to use that information to inform how the SART moves forward, because this person has history that is outside of the SART, and also experiences of how a person may experience the SART from the outside looking in. And I think that is invaluable information. I have experienced personally the lack of inclusion in our sexual assault response teams. And it feels as if the voices of folks who are most impacted by this issue are not welcome because of policies and because of levels of professionalism. And it would seem that the people who are experiencing the harm that's been caused to them sexually would be the experts in how they've experienced the harm and how to prevent the harm from happening, or even how to intersect or how to intervene in the harm happening for other folks. I think that the information that we bring is valuable. And so when we're able to bring it and to have it received in a way that honors our voices and our experiences, then that makes all of the responses better. There are challenges with working with anyone from any population, and there is no one size fits all, or no, like, now this is the antidote, right? When I come to the table, I am a Black woman, I am queer, I am differently abled, I have different, like, I'm a survivor of sexual trauma, I'm a survivor of child witness to domestic violence. I have so many different layers of trauma that I've experienced. So when I come to the table, there are some things that I need, right? And some of those things include having a welcoming face when I come to the table. It includes, if I didn't, so I'm an educated woman, I have a master's in business administration. Some folks don't have that, right? So I have a layer of privilege. It involves recognizing our privileges. It involves making sure that when we're at the table, we're not speaking in languages that and using words that are not welcoming to the folks who we've invited to the table. And it's also about not making assumptions about where people are at either, right? So it's always good to check in, which I think makes some folks feel vulnerable. And I think that could be difficult to put yourself in a vulnerable situation. But a lot of folks who are at the margins have always been in vulnerable situations. We come to the meetings and we're scared. We're scared we're going to say something wrong. And I think that it takes people to take, like, from sexual assault response teams, to take risk. To risk the fact that you may say something wrong. And when you do say something wrong, if you do say something wrong, get back up and try it again. Correct the harm and get back up and try it again. Don't go wallow and try to figure out, like, I don't know, but just don't go wallow and come back to the table and figure it out. I think that there are so many things that, like, we just forget because there's this layer of, like, oh, we're professionals and, this is my title. And we forget that we're actually humans. We're humans who are intersecting with someone who is at the worst stage of their life. And because they're at the worst stage of their life, or they're possibly recovering from this situation, we forget that, we could possibly have been this person, or a family member could have possibly been this person. And we should treat them how we would want our family member treated, or how we would want ourselves to be treated, right? So I think that there are a number of things that we can do. I would define an underserved population. Well, actually, I wouldn't even use the term underserved population. I think that is that's a term that's used by, funders. It's used by organizations to describe a group of people who have less power in society. So whoever is at the margins, right? So we're talking about people who have immigration considerations. We're talking about people who are differently able. We're talking about people who are First Nations folks who have been on this land and their land was stolen and they're survivors of genocide. We're talking about people who are the descendants of kidnapped and enslaved folks. We're talking about just a wide variety of people who are here, who have less power in society, who have been pushed to the margins. And so when we use the word underserved, it implies that folks are marginalized because they're not served. And folks are marginalized because they have less power, because there are systems and there are people who have power over their lives and they create policies to maintain that power. So I don't use the word underserved very often in my daily language, because I think that it speaks more to placing the blame on a person who is in that community versus saying that they are impacted by this power imbalance, which is one of the reasons why, we're here talking about sexual assault response teams, right? Because of the power imbalance. And there's also language barriers. So systems folks speak a lot of acronyms, there's this level of academic or academia that's often spoken. And so making sure that when we are inviting folks to the table, that we're speaking in languages that are conducive to, like, actually bridging the gap and not speaking over folks' heads and, using all of our wonderful acronyms that we use in the sexual assault and the domestic violence worlds. Like we know what we're talking about, but someone who's not from this field of work, it may be confusing, and it may be a hindrance for them wanting to come to the table, because who wants to say, like, hey, I'm the only one who doesn't know what that means or what this means? It's embarrassing. So we need to make sure that we're, like, making sure that we're open and we're greeting people and building relationship, because I'm all about relationship building. If I don't think that you care about me, why would I care that you want me to come and speak and be your survivor that you want to like parade around as if I'm some like oddity? Like, oh, she speaks well. Like that's oftentimes how people are received and how people are exploited. Their experiences are exploited. So keep in mind that people's experiences are exploited on a daily basis, and danger is a very real thing in a lot of our communities. And it's not always from the folks who we think are the danger, right? So I think there are a lot of things to keep in mind when it comes to engaging non-traditional communities and a lot of barriers. I think that the main thing is making sure that we are open to bridging the gap and that we're open to looking at a person like they are a person, right? Because some of our communities have been denied that humanity. So it starts with a conversation. It starts with a hi, how are you? And if there is some distrust in the beginning and you are a white, able-bodied, straight Christian person, please understand that traditionally, these are folks who've been seated in a position of power, who've controlled and dominated a lot of folks' lives, So don't get upset and don't take it personally, but understand that just like we come with history, you come with history too, and we've got to figure out a way to bridge that gap and to make sure that we heal those histories, because we've got a lot of future generations coming, and we've got to figure this out. We've got to be able to see humanity in each other and to treat each other accordingly, and not let our titles get in the way and not let our experiences get in the way. And if they do get in the way, we've got to make sure that we are the people that we need to see in each other, So I could be having a bad day, but because I have a position of power, a person could interpret it differently. They could interpret it like, oh, well, they're just not talking to me because they don't think I'm worthwhile. We've got to keep in mind that a lot of this trauma responses of a sexual assault survivor, when you're also including, okay, well, you're a sexual assault survivor and you're also a member of a queer community and you're also an African-American person who's differently abled, like you've got to consider all of those things, and know that your actions may not just be your actions, but they could be internalized as something different, and take that into consideration. Not that we have to walk around taking care of everyone, but just know that if we're inviting folks to the table, that we've got to consider our layers of identity and how people could be perceiving those layers of identity and extend an extra olive branch at times. And food is always good. It is always good to make sure that folks are fed, to break bread together, to talk about things that are other than work. Because for some folks, who are in a part of a traditional SART, you go to work, you do your 9 to 5, and then you go home. And for most of us, like we go to work, we on our way home, we're pulled over by law enforcement. Then we get a phone call that, this has happened to another member of the community, or this community member has died. And, there's so many different layers to our existence and to our survival, and so it feels good to know that we can remove ourselves from some of those things at times and to be just seen as us. Like I am not only a mother, but I'm a person who's sitting here trying to engage and trying to help create a better community for my children and my children's children, and I think that sometimes that needs to be taken into consideration too. And I by no means speak for everyone in the communities that I identify with, right? I am a African American woman, so when a SART tries to engage me personally, I would need for them to consider the fact that, the community that I come from has a history of slavery in this country, right? A history of being kidnapped, enslaved, treated as property, all of the same tenets that, cause sexual violence. We have a lot of those intersecting oppressions, right? So when we're talking about engaging in a non-traditional member into a system, which is how I look at it. I look at it as like, whoa, all of these entities, the hospital system, law enforcement, child protective services, we have disproportionate rates in terms of the African American community in each of those systems. And now you want me to come to this system and further disengage my community. And so there needs to be conversation around that, right? And there needs to be space to honor those experiences, because there are places and there are people who come to the table with this knowledge that, hey, my community, It was legal to rape folks in my community. You know, it was legal to rape my ancestors here. Child sexual assault did not exist because my ancestors were considered property. You know, and that's the baggage that I come to the table with. And my experiences are not outside of social context. So I know very well that at any point I can be pulled over by law enforcement and be killed. That needs to be taken into consideration. I know at any point my 20-year-old son, and my 22-year-old daughter could be killed based on stereotypes, based on perceptions of who they are and what they are, and how they interact and how they could be a threat. I know that at any point in time, anyone from a SART could say, hey, I feel threatened, and there goes a life. You know, and I think that, so we need to understand there's a power imbalance when we're talking about bringing folks from the community to the table. Involving non-traditional members into SART and protecting confidentiality is it's a very touchy situation, to say the least. And I think it depends on how far a SART is willing to go, because a lot of systems, a lot of policies have been in place to make sure that people are excluded. And I don't think that's something that's really recognized within SARTs. There are a lot of, like most of the systems that have been in place, like, for instance, when slavery was still legal. So this same system is now supposed to come to my defense that, you know, once said that raping a Black woman was legal, you know? And so when we look at how those systems, you know, can now protect confidentiality, I'm looking at a lot of the folks that I work with not trusting systems, right? But they trust me. So I come to the table with a wealth of knowledge from the community, and it could be of help to the system and at the table. But there's this layer that says that, oh, well, you know, you're not a legal advocate, you're not a person who's engaged with law enforcement, you're not a SANE nurse, you're not from CPS, so now you're not relevant. And that's kind of how it comes across. So I think in bridging that barrier or that gap, there could be some conversations around policies, like what exactly is the policy, or the confidentiality clause that is within each of those systems, and figuring out a way that honors both the case and the confidentiality of folks, but also honors the people who are, like, actually working with the community and the survivors, because those are the folks whose voices and whose experiences are going to help us move this thing forward. I'm going to sound like a pie in the sky. I am a really huge advocate of us seeing our humanity. I have to go back to that. I think before anything, before the title, before the promotion, before the policy that was passed, before all of that, like, we are people. We are all people. And I would just advocate for folks to just really start realizing that, and to see that, you know, this is not case number X, Y, and Z. This is a person, first and foremost, who may have layers of identity, who may or may not have a child, who, you know, there's so many different layers and aspects to us. And I think that I would just go back to the first things first. Like, it starts with us. It starts with us. It starts with whether we are willing to, like, change the norm and challenge the status quo. It starts with whether we are willing to be that person who goes out into the community where we are completely uncomfortable and engages folks. Like, it literally starts there. And I think that sometimes people in systems, they're like, well, this is my 9 to 5, you know, and you don't go to community events. You don't pick up the phone and call anyone from this underserved community that you serve, air quotes. You know, there's so many different layers to this. And so that's why oftentimes we'll say, okay, well, you know, I personally, I would want a sexual assault advocate who looks like me, who has some of the similar experiences, where I can say something and I don't need to explain what I'm saying it, because why I'm saying it, because culturally this person knows where I'm coming from. Sometimes we want that, you know, and sometimes it's nice to have someone who's not from our culture, who says, hey, look, I may not know this. You know, there's that layer of vulnerability, right? Like, admitting that you don't know something. People in power have a hard time admitting that. And so in terms of breaking barriers and bridging gaps, if you can be a person in power who admits that they don't know something to a person who has less power, that within itself is huge, and it's powerful, and it is needed.